Well, hello, and thank you very much for having me. My name is Marian Tupy, and I'm the editor of humanprogress.org. I'm also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and it is a great pleasure to be talking to you today. I don't see the presentation, so I cannot see which. Oh, there we go. There we go. Very good. Next slide. So today we have much to get through. My talk is going to be divided into three parts. First of all, I'm going to ask, is there evidence for human progress? Then I'm going to ask, if so, what are the causes of progress? And then in the last part of my chat, I'm going to ask, does rational optimism about the future make sense? First, is there evidence for human progress? This is life expectancy at birth over the last 12,000 years. And as you can see, for the first, well, almost the entirety of 12,000 years, life expectancy was between 25 and 30 years. It was the same at the birth of the agricultural revolution. It was the same when the first city of Uruk was built. It was the same at the time of Jesus or Augustus. And then during the Enlightenment, during the scientific revolution, we saw a slight increase in life expectancy, especially in Western countries. But then really during the late 19th century, especially during the 20th century, it skyrocketed. So today, life expectancy around the world is about 72 years. In the United States, about 78 years. And there are places in the world where people can expect to live into their 80s on average. Now, the great thing about life expectancy is that it's not only increasing in rich countries, but it is also increasing in developing countries. If you can click again on this slide, you will see that the gap in life expectancy over the last 60 years or so has declined from 23 years to 8 years between developed and developing countries. So as developing countries become richer, as they embrace new or more modern scientific methods, medical knowledge, and so forth, life expectancy has been increasing, and the gap between the rich and the poor has been decreasing. And of course, if we can go to the next slide, life expectancy is partly driven by a massive decline in child mortality. As late as the 18th century, in the most advanced countries in the world, like Norway, for example, or Sweden, roughly 50% of babies could die between in their first year or before they turned 5. Today, a fraction of children die before the age of 5. And once again, what we see is that the developing countries are catching up with the developed countries. So let me just rephrase that. One of the greatest contributors to life expectancy is declining child mortality, and that trend is greatly improving. Another very important indicator of human well-being is increase in GDP per person, or increase in global wealth, the productivity of the global economy. So if you click on this slide again, what you see is that for the last 12,000 years or so, people could live on about $2 per person per day. One of the reasons why we talk about absolute poverty, or why we measure absolute poverty at $2 per person per day, is because if you are earning or making less than $2 per person per day, then you are probably starving. So $2 per person per day is the absolute level of poverty. And that's what it was like for many thousands of years. By the 1800s, let's say the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, the GDP per person per day rose to $2.80. But over the last 200 years, it had skyrocketed to $40 per person per day. Remember that these figures are adjusted for inflation. That means that today in the world, if you take a country right in the middle of the spectrum, place like Brazil, for example, people can earn $40 per person per day, which is quite amazing. And over the last 100 years, the global economy grew at about 1.8% per year. And if that particular growth continues, then by 2100, people will be earning on average, $166 per person per day, again, in inflation-adjusted dollars. So this is the hockey stick of human progress. And as you can see, the last 200 years really make a fundamental difference from what came before. Now, the developing world is catching up with the developed world in terms of income. If you can click on this slide once again, what you notice is that there is a massive gap that has opened in terms of absolute amount of dollars that people earn, from $10,000 in 1952 to $45,000 in 2019 in developed countries, and from about $1,600 to $13,000 in developing countries. But those are the absolute figures. Once you look at the share of the income earned by people in developing countries as opposed to developed countries, what you see is that that has risen from 16% to 29%. And of course, as people are becoming richer, absolute poverty has been declining. So at the beginning of the 19th century, about 90% of people lived in absolute poverty. By the year 2000, by the beginning of the new millennium, about 30% of people lived in absolute poverty. Today, that's down to less than 8%, or at least it was before the COVID pandemic. Obviously, there is going to be some slide back. Millions of people are going to return into absolute poverty. But between the new millennium and 2020, we have seen the greatest reduction in absolute poverty ever recorded in human history. Not only are we earning more, but we are also working less. In high-income OECD countries from 1950 to 2017, the number of hours worked declined by 21%, in the United States by 11%. The reason why I decided to include South Korea is because what tends to happen in very poor countries is that as they depart from agricultural living into industrialization, the numbers of hours that people actually work increases because people are getting compensated better, they are more productive, they are bringing in more money, and so they are incentivized to work more. But at some point, they also decide to prioritize other things, spending time with their family, more time for leisure, and so forth. So South Korea is a perfect example of a country which started to industrialize in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. People worked more, but once they reached a certain level of income, they started working less. And that's what we are seeing everywhere around the world. As people grow richer, they start working less. Part of the time that we save by not working, we spend educating ourselves. At the beginning, or rather at the end of the 19th century, the global education per person was about 0.5 years per lifetime. So on average, your average inhabitant of the world was educated less than 1 year in a lifetime. By 2010, people spent about 9 years in education overall. Part of that was primary, part of it was secondary, part of it was tertiary. And by 2040, it is estimated that people will, on average, spend about 11 years of their lives at school. Concomitantly with the increases in education come increases in literacy. If you click on this slide again, what you see is that in 1870, French literacy rate was about 69%. Today in Sub-Saharan Africa, click again, please. Today in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's 66%. So overall in the world, well over 80, maybe 85% of the world are literate. There are some people who are never going to become literate because they come from very poor societies and they're too old to learn. But overall literacy is obviously very much up. And even in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the world's poorest continent, the literacy rate is roughly where it was in France at the end of the 19th century. Another positive aspect of modernity is that we are killing each other much less than we used to. At the time of Michelangelo or Da Vinci in 15th century Italy, about 70 out of 100,000 people could expect to be murdered during their lifetimes. If you click one more time, that's 73 out of 100,000 people could expect to be murdered in their lifetimes. But today, in Western Europe, fewer than one person per 100,000 gets murdered. In the United States, that figure is actually quite high by Western standards, about 4 or 5. But generally, we have seen a tremendous decline in interpersonal violence in the last 500 years or so. We see similar trends in global conflicts, international conflicts, which is to say conflicts between countries where two countries go to war, they declare war on each other, send armies across borders. Those have basically declined to zero. Even when countries invade one another, like Russia did with Ukraine, they don't actually declare wars on each other. And today, most of the conflicts are civil wars. Part of the reason why the blue line and the yellow line merge into each other is because most of the conflicts in the world today are actually civil wars. And we have seen a dramatic decline in conflict after the fall of communism in 1989. You can click again. Yes, those are the trends I was talking about. Okay, another thing that's happening is that whilst we have fewer wars, they're also becoming less deadly. So whether you're talking about civil wars or colonial conflicts or wars between states over since the end of the Second World War, they have become less deadly. Not only are we safer from one another, but we're also safer from the acts of God, so to speak. Climate-related deaths, from things like heat or cold have decreased by about 99% over the last 100 years. And non-climate related deaths are holding pretty much steady. That's because we can never predict things like explosions of volcano and so forth. But certainly climate related deaths are declining. And that's partly because we are able to we have better technology. We are able to track hurricanes. We are able to build sturdier buildings. We are able to warn the population from oncoming bad weather. And consequently, people can take better care of themselves. And so we have seen a massive decline in that particular trend. Since the end of communism in 1989, 1990, we have also seen a flourishing of democracy. In the 1980s, there were many more autocracies in the world than democracies, but that had flipped in 1989 or so. And today, there are many more democracies in the world than autocracies. Anocracies, which is the gray line, are countries which exhibit both features of democracy and also features of autocracy. Now, obviously, we are very concerned that in some countries in the world, democracy is weakening, and we have seen some serious reversals in democratization. And so this is one trend that needs to be looked at very carefully, especially moving into the future. But it's certainly not true that democracy is in full retreat. Democracy has flourished in the last 30 years or so. And even though the trend lines are becoming to change, we are still living at a very good time for democratic decision making. And so all of that, declining wars and natural disasters and so forth, means that there are many fewer of us. At the time of Christ or Augustus, there were only 300 million people in the world. And today there are 7.8 billion of us. What does that mean? Let's go to the next slide. Well, one of the very interesting things is that contrary to many gloomy predictions, we are actually not running out of food. Access to food, measured as calories per person per day, had been increasing since the 1960s. And today, in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the poorest continent in the world, people have access to just about as many calories as the Portuguese did in the early 1960s. Now, that doesn't mean that those calories are evenly distributed. There are some places in Africa, especially, where due to wars and political mismanagement, starvation still takes place. But overall, calories have been increasing as agriculture has become more productive and people are able to produce more food. Contrary to predictions, also, the commodities, natural resources are becoming cheaper rather than more expensive. There are three lines in this chart I would like you to take notice of. The green line signifies nominal prices. Those are prices which reflect the value of the currency of the day. And because our currency gets devalued every year through fiat money printing, you would obviously expect nominal prices to go up. But look at the real price, which is inflation adjusted price. That's the orange line. What the orange line shows you is that adjusted for inflation, prices of 50 most important commodities, we are talking about things like lumber and zinc and oranges and pork and beef and whatever else, have been declining. Now, the third line, which is the time price, as I call it, is price of commodities, which reflects also increases in wages. Real prices, inflation-adjusted prices, only reflect inflation. But because people generally earn above inflation, in other words, as they become more productive, they earn more income than is the inflation rate. We also need to adjust the prices of commodities by wages. And once you look at the prices of commodities relative to wages, what you see that they have declined by about 70% over the last 40 years or so. And this is a chart I decided to include because I know that last year was very difficult for a lot of people, and rightly so. It was an awful time. A lot of people have died. But look at the speed of progress when it comes to tackling of some of the most devastating diseases in the world. Prior to the modern era, which is to say the last 200, 300 years or so, people really had no idea how sick they were, or rather what sickness they were suffering from. And, they certainly didn't know how to cure it. We have evidence of smallpox and polio going back to ancient Egypt and India 3,500 years ago, but those things got solved only very recently. It took 3,500 years for people to figure out how to cure these things. Ebola took 43 years. The access to life-saving HIV drugs took about 15 years. And COVID took less than 1 year. In other words, by the time that the global pandemic became obvious in February, March 2020, first people to receive their vaccines in the United States and in Britain, which was the first country to implement vaccination, happened before the end of 2020. So this shows you what happens when a society has wealth, tremendous amount of knowledge, computing power, and dedicated, smart scientists working on solving of our problems. So that this is a very positive trend. We are really able to tackle problems in a much shorter span of time. Okay, so the planet has more people who are freer, who live longer, who are better educated, consume more food, enjoy higher incomes, work less, they fight less, have access to more abundant resources. If we can go to the next slide. And so here in the last part of my presentation, what I want to talk about is reasons for progress. So one of the most important reasons for progress was geopolitical competition and institutional change. Prior to the modern era, the world was dominated or tended to be dominated by large empires. And large empires are usually quite safe from foreign invasions or foreign conquest. They are mostly concerned about internal cohesion. And as a consequence of that, in large empires, be it the Ottomans or the Chinese or the Russians, the governing elites tended to prioritize internal control and destruction and suppression of dissent and preservation of the status quo. Europe was the exception. The Habsburgs attempted to create a universal empire in Europe, but they ultimately failed. And so Europe never was, after the fall of the Roman Empire, under control of a single dynasty. And what the European elites realized in the 16th and 17th centuries and going onwards is that they could remain independent. They could continue to rule their countries so long as they permitted greater liberality, greater openness at home. European elites of this period made a calculated decision. By opening internally and becoming less powerful internally, by allowing dissent, by allowing discussion, by allowing innovation, they could create more growth, they could create more power, and therefore keep themselves independent from foreign invasions. And so, whilst the elites became safe from foreigners, they also became more accountable to their own people. And this is essentially the birth of open, liberal, inclusive European and economic and political institutions. By prioritizing economic growth as a way of survival, European elites have basically opened up space for liberalism, for internal dissent, for internal discussion. There was also a change in thought which happened contemporaneously. Before the modern era, there was a holisticity in knowledge. In other words, people were asking questions like, what does this piece of new knowledge say about our understanding of the universe, and more importantly, about our understanding of God? Part of the reason why it was so difficult to convince humanity about the heliocentric understanding of the universe, the fact that Earth is not in the middle of the solar system, is because this piece of knowledge contradicted the holisticity of our understanding of universe and God's place in it. Similarly, dissection of the human body and development of new understandings of disease rubbed against our understanding of how people fall sick. So instead of falling sick because they were sinful, scientists could argue that people fell sick because maybe they didn't partake in very good hygiene and things like that. So holisticity of knowledge and the centrality of religion in our intellectual view of the world played a very negative role for a very long time in quashing innovation, intellectual innovation, and so forth. The wars of religion changed that in a sense that they introduced skepticism about grand narratives. New religions like Protestantism, for example, had to come up with new arguments to justify their own existence. But more importantly, they continued to undermine the monopoly on knowledge and wisdom of the predominant Catholic Church. And so there was a lot of intellectual awakening and a fluorescence of argumentation and skepticism as a result of the wars of religion. And of course, the Westphalian Peace in 1648 basically enshrined into the European geopolitical landscape the fact that different Protestant faiths and Catholic faiths had to coexist, and the intellectual conversation, skepticism, argumentation, that persevered until today. And it is also in the second half of the last millennium that we have the rise of critical rationalism, where people like Descartes and people like Francis Bacon basically argue, well, if we no longer have this grand narrative which explains everything, the universe, man's place in the universe, then in order to get at the truth, what we need to do, we need to experiment, and only experimentation critical rationalism can lead us to the truth. So this is what I would call a change in thought that happens in Europe in the second half of the last millennium. And finally, we had a profound change in ethics. The leading intellectuals of the Enlightenment, Adam Smith, Ferguson, people like that, Montesquieu, emphasized the great importance of trade. Voltaire famously talked about the Amsterdam Stock Exchange as a place where a Catholic, a Protestant, a Mohammedan, and a Jew can coexist and cooperate in the pursuit of profit. Frederick Bastiat talked about the importance of international commerce because it was international commerce and mutual dependency of countries on one another that were preferable to armies crossing borders and killing a lot of people. So, but the change in ethics needed for Europeans to really reevaluate their understanding, or rather their ethical attitude to commerce, which, like in any other society, was poo-pooed for millennia. People who were involved in commerce were always looked down upon. It was the aristocracy, the clergy, and the military, which were considered to be the epitome of good life, how a gentleman should behave. Commercial enterprise was always looked down upon as something dirty. That starts to change in the 17th and 18th centuries, where people begin to see commercial enterprise, participation in economic activity as perfectly legitimate and even in some cases noble endeavor. And finally, we have a change in attitudes to innovation. For most of human history, innovation was considered to be a dirty word because obviously innovation had political connotations, and the elites of yesteryear, they had a great degree of interest in preserving the status quo. So innovation, bringing up new technologies or new knowledge or even new political arrangements were very much frowned upon. But then it emerged that innovation could be good. Following the Glorious Revolution in Britain and following the American Revolution in the United States, people started realizing that not all political changes, I'm talking innovation now in its political sense, that not all political changes, all political innovations had to be bad. And the same came with technology. After Jenner started vaccinating people in the late 18th century, after understanding of the germ theory of disease came up and so forth, it was very difficult to deny that actually innovation is a good thing. So whereas for millennia, people used to poo-poo innovation, in more recent years, innovation has become something admirable, and innovators now enjoy an almost heroic status in our society. People like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. That is certainly something that didn't used to happen before. So can progress continue? Well, British historian Thomas Babington Macaulay asked almost 200 years ago, on what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? So given how much goodness, how much progress humanity has achieved in the past, I think that it is perfectly reasonable to be rationally optimistic that future problems that face humanity will also be able to be resolved by human species. But in order to do that, we need to do a few things. First of all, we need to protect freedom of speech and inquiry. Freedom of speech is very important on a macro level because it allows our society, dissenters within our society, to tell politicians, but also their fellow human beings, fellow citizens, that the society is moving in the wrong direction, that we are going to go over the cliff. So there's a macro level where people need to say no. The course on which the society has embarked is wrong, and we should look for alternatives. But freedom of speech is also incredibly important on a micro level. If people are not allowed to research sensitive subjects, biology and things like that, then that would obviously also be very bad for human progress. We also need freedom to innovate. We need to get away from this notion that innovation has to be perfectly safe in order to be marketable, like the precautionary principle, which is currently dominating the thinking in the European Union. We have to allow for innovation to take place. And of course, the other great danger that is facing us is a return of protectionism and autarky. Commerce is a great boon for the world, not just the poorest people in the world, but also the rest of us, and we need to maintain it. And finally, never forget that any governing elite in any country has an interest in the status quo. Bureaucracies tend to strangle progress. And so we have to be very conscientious that overregulation can actually destroy progress moving forward. So if you are interested in progress, please check out my first book, 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know, and many others you will find interesting. It did pretty well on Amazon. You can also follow us on social media. And if you are interested in learning more about human progress, please go to our website, humanprogress.org. Thank you very much.